She was 26 years old and had $11 to her name when the Larkspur Hollow School Board voted to end her career. The man who read the verdict aloud, a banker named Cyrus Vance who had appointed himself president of that board through sheer persistence and the debts half the town owed him, called her unfit to teach the children of decent families, though the accusation he leveled against her was built from nothing but a rumor and his own convenience. She left the schoolhouse that had been her whole life with a carpetbag, a small tin of savings, and a grief so quiet it barely showed on her face. Within the month, wandering past the crumbling remains of an older schoolhouse 2 miles outside of town, abandoned for a generation and slated for the auction block, she heard the auctioneer's gavel fall on a bid of $9, hers, the last of what she had, for a building most people in Larkspur Hollow called a pile of rotten boards not worth the nails holding it together. They laughed when she signed the paper. What none of them knew, what she herself did not yet know, was that somewhere behind the old blackboard still bolted to that schoolhouse's front wall, a secret had been waiting patiently for 22 years to be found by someone with the patience to look, a secret that would not only change the shape of her own life but would settle, finally and quietly, an old debt the town of Larkspur Hollow did not know it was owed. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Clara Whitfield. You are watching this from a place that has been written off by people who never bother to look closely. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. Clara Whitfield had been raised on the flat golden plains of eastern Nebraska Territory, in a soddy house her father built with his own hands the year before she was born, on a homestead so far from any town that the nearest neighbor was visible only as a thread of smoke on clear mornings. Her mother, Ruth, had been a schoolteacher back in Ohio before she married and came west, and it was Ruth who first put a slate in Clara's hands before the girl could properly walk a straight line, insisting that a mind was the one piece of property no bank, no drought, and no husband could ever repossess. Clara's father, a quiet man named Everett who spoke more to his horses than to people, farmed wheat and raised a small herd of cattle, and from him Clara learned a different kind of lesson, one about patience with things that seemed dead in the ground until, given enough season and enough faith, they were not. She remembered him kneeling in the black furrows each spring, pressing seed into soil that looked to her child's eyes like nothing at all, saying that anyone who judged a field by how it looked in March had no business calling himself a farmer. It was a lesson she would not understand the full weight of until she was a grown woman standing in front of a ruined building that everyone else in her life had already judged and discarded. Her mother taught her not only letters and sums but the deeper craft of teaching itself, how to kneel at a child's height rather than lecture down at them, how silence could be a better teacher than scolding, how a lesson delivered with respect took root where one delivered with impatience simply withered. By 12, Clara was helping her mother teach the younger children who came for lessons in their front room, and by 16, after her mother's health began to fail from a lung sickness that would eventually take her, Clara had effectively become the teacher herself, holding the little schoolroom together through sheer will while nursing her mother through her final 2 winters. Ruth Whitfield died in the spring Clara turned 18, and her last words to her daughter, spoken so quietly Clara had to lean close to hear them, were that a person's worth was never decided by the room they were standing in, only by what they chose to build inside it. Everett Whitfield followed his wife in death only 3 years later, worn through by grief and by a lung fever of his own that the harsh winters of the territory seemed to specialize in delivering to those who had already given everything they had to the land. Clara, 21 and alone, sold the homestead for barely enough to cover her father's debts, and took the only path a respectable unmarried woman of her education could take in that country. She became a schoolteacher, moving from town to town on the modest salaries such positions paid, until 5 years ago she had arrived in Larkspur Hollow and found, for the first time since her parents died, something that felt almost like home. Larkspur Hollow was a modest town built along a slow bend of the Platte, its 200 or so families making their living from wheat, from cattle, and increasingly from the small bank that Cyrus Vance had built up over 15 years into the most powerful institution in the county. Vance was not a cruel man by his own estimation, he was, rather, a man who had convinced himself that whatever served his own advancement also served the town's, and he had a talent for arranging circumstances so that the two aligned with suspicious regularity. When Clara arrived, fresh from a teaching post in a smaller settlement 2 counties over, she found a town in need of a proper schoolteacher and a school board eager to hire one, and for 4 years she gave that town everything her mother had taught her to give: patience, respect, and a fierce, unglamorous devotion to children whom other adults had already given up on, including a boy named Samuel Pruitt whose stutter had earned him ridicule from every teacher before her, and whom Clara taught to read aloud without shame by having him read to the youngest children, who did not care how the words came out as long as the stories were good. She built, in Larkspur Hollow, the beginnings of a life. She had a small rented room above the mercantile, a modest garden she tended on Sundays, a circle of friends among the other unmarried women of the town, and a reputation, hard-won, as one of the finest teachers the county had ever seen. It was this very reputation, ironically, that made her useful to Cyrus Vance's downfall of her, because a teacher too well loved was a teacher whose sudden removal required a story sturdy enough to survive scrutiny, and Vance, as it happened, was very good at building sturdy stories out of nothing at all. The trouble began, as most trouble in small towns begins, with money that had gone missing and no one willing to admit where it had actually gone. The school board kept a modest fund, contributions from local families meant to cover slates, primers, and the occasional repair to the schoolhouse roof, and that spring the fund came up $11 short. It was a trivial sum, the kind of shortfall any honest bookkeeper might attribute to a miscounted purchase or a merchant's error, but Cyrus Vance, who happened to be the very man who held the fund's ledger and made the withdrawals from his own bank on the board's behalf, stood before a hastily assembled meeting and announced, with practiced sorrow, that he had discovered the discrepancy traced directly to Miss Whitfield's requisitions. He produced a page of figures that did not, in fact, prove anything at all when examined closely, but no one in that room was inclined to examine anything closely, because Cyrus Vance held the mortgage on half the farms represented in that meeting, and disagreeing with him publicly was not a habit that served a man well in Larkspur Hollow. Clara stood and said, plainly and without raising her voice, that she had never touched a cent of that fund beyond what was properly requisitioned and receipted, and she asked to see the full ledger for herself. Vance declined, citing the lateness of the hour, and the board, eager to be done with an uncomfortable evening, voted 3-1 to terminate her position effective immediately. Only Hiram Cole, the old blacksmith who had watched his granddaughter transform under Clara's teaching from a frightened, silent child into a girl who read aloud proudly at the harvest gathering, voted against it, and even he could not sway the room. What none of them said aloud, though Clara suspected it within days, was that Vance had his own reasons for wanting the town's small school reorganized under new leadership, reasons that had nothing to do with $11 missing and everything to do with a piece of land 2 miles outside of town where an older, abandoned schoolhouse had stood empty for over 20 years, a schoolhouse built decades earlier by a man named Josiah Abernathy, whose name Clara had heard mentioned only in passing, in the tone people use for local legends half forgotten. She did not yet know that Vance's father, Silas Vance, had been the banker in Larkspur Hollow before Cyrus, or that the elder Vance's dealings with Josiah Abernathy were the true root of everything that would follow. She knew only that she had been publicly shamed, quietly and thoroughly ruined in the eyes of a town she loved, and left with nothing but a small trunk of belongings, a battered copy of her mother's old primer, and $11 in a tin box, the exact sum, though she did not notice the cruel coincidence until much later, that the school fund had supposedly come up short. For 2 weeks Clara took in mending and helped Hiram Cole's wife with washing to keep herself fed, sleeping in a corner of the Coles barn because her room above the mercantile had gone to the family of the new teacher Vance had already arranged to hire, a young cousin of his wife's from Omaha who had never taught a day in her life but came with the correct last name. It was on one of those long, humiliated afternoons, walking the 2 miles out past the edge of town simply to be alone with her thoughts, that Clara came upon the old Abernathy schoolhouse, sitting in a field gone wild with sunflowers and thistle, its clapboard side silvered by decades of weather, its roof sagging on the north side like a shoulder that had given up carrying a burden, its single door hanging from one hinge. A weathered notice nailed to a fence post announced that the property, along with the surrounding acre, would be sold at auction the following Saturday by order of the county, the last of the Abernathy estate finally being cleared from the books after Josiah's grandson, the final heir, had died the previous winter without issue and without, it seemed, much interest in what he was leaving behind. Clara stood in the tall grass and looked at that ruined building for a long time, and something in her, some stubborn seed of her father's patience and her mother's faith in rooms that could be built up from nothing, told her to come back on Saturday with what money she had left. The auction was a small, unceremonious affair held in the yard of the county courthouse, attended mostly by men interested in the acre of decent bottomland the schoolhouse sat upon, who assumed, correctly, that the building itself would need to be torn down before the land could be put to any real use. When the auctioneer called the lot, several men murmured amused bids of $2 or $3, more as a formality than genuine interest, until Clara, standing at the back in her plain gray dress with her chin lifted the way her mother had taught her to hold it even, especially, when the room did not respect her, called out $9, every cent she had left in the world save for two she kept folded separately for bread. A ripple of laughter went through the small crowd. Someone said loud enough for her to hear that Miss Whitfield had apparently traded one condemned schoolhouse for another. The auctioneer, an older man named Thaddeus Gray who had known Clara's late father slightly, hesitated a moment as though giving anyone else the chance to top her bid out of simple mercy, but no one did, because no one else wanted a ruin sitting on a foundation that would need to be replaced. The gavel fell. The land and the building belonged to Clara Whitfield for $9, and as she walked forward to sign the paper, she heard Cyrus Vance's voice, unmistakable even from across the yard, remark to the man beside him that it was, in his opinion, the saddest kind of foolishness, throwing good money after a pile of rotten boards nobody sensible would touch. Clara did not turn around. She signed her name, took the deed, and walked the 2 miles back out to what was now, however improbably, hers. She spent her first days there simply clearing brush and pulling the wild sunflowers back from the door, sleeping on a bedroll inside because the Coles barn, kind as they had been, could not go on housing her indefinitely, and there was a strange, settling comfort in sleeping inside 4 walls that belonged to no one but herself, even walls this broken. It was on the 4th evening, sweeping 2 decades of dust and dead leaves from the schoolroom floor by the light of a single lantern, that her broom caught on something at the base of the old blackboard, a massive slate panel nearly the width of the room, still bolted to the front wall on iron brackets gone orange with rust. Behind the swept dust, she noticed the wall beneath the blackboard did not sit quite flush, a hairline gap running along its bottom edge that no ordinary settling of an old building should have produced so evenly. She knelt and pressed her palm against the wood paneling to either side of the slate and felt, unmistakably, a give in the wall that had no business being there, a seam disguised for years beneath a coat of whitewash gone yellow with age. It took her the better part of 2 more evenings, working carefully by lantern light with a pry bar borrowed from Hiram Cole, who asked no questions when she requested it, only nodded the way a man nods at someone he trusts to know her own business, before she understood what she was looking at. The great blackboard was not simply mounted to the wall, it was hinged, cleverly and deliberately, along its left edge, concealed by a facing board that had been built to look like ordinary wall paneling. When at last she found the small iron catch hidden beneath the chalk tray and pressed it free, the entire blackboard swung outward on its hidden hinges with a groan of protest from hardware that had not moved in over 20 years, revealing behind it a shallow room. No more than 5 feet deep and the width of the blackboard itself, built directly into the thickness of the schoolhouse's false front wall, a room that from the outside would have appeared to be nothing more than the depth of the building's frame. Inside, by the trembling light of her lantern, Clara found a small iron strongbox, a stack of ledgers tied with cracking twine, a leather satchel gone stiff with age, and, propped carefully against the back wall as though someone had placed it there with great tenderness and never returned, a framed daguerreotype portrait of a stern-faced man with kind eyes standing beside a young woman who bore a striking resemblance to no one Clara had ever met, and a folded document sealed with wax that had, remarkably, never been broken. She sat on the schoolroom floor for a long while before she touched anything further, understanding somehow that she had stumbled into the middle of a story that had been waiting a very long time to be finished. The ledgers, once she began reading them by lantern light over the following nights, told her the story of Josiah Abernathy, who had come to the Larkspur Hollow country in the earliest days of its settlement, a self-made man of modest wealth from a freighting business he had built along the old trails, who believed with an almost religious conviction that education was the one true inheritance a community could leave its children regardless of how poor their families might otherwise be. Abernathy had built the schoolhouse himself in the year 1867, funding it entirely from his own pocket, and more than that, he had established an endowment, a trust of gold coin and railroad bonds meant to keep that school free to every child in the county forever, taught by teachers paid a proper wage regardless of how thin the harvest ran in any given year. The ledgers recorded, in Abernathy's own careful hand, years of contributions, expenditures, and a growing, guarded worry about a man named Silas Vance, the young banker newly arrived in the territory, who had begun, subtly at first and then with increasing boldness, to press Abernathy toward investing the endowment's funds through his bank, where Silas could, Abernathy suspected, quietly redirect a portion of it into his own ventures. The final ledger entry, dated only weeks before an entry recording Abernathy's sudden death from what the town at the time called a seizure of the heart, described a confrontation in which Abernathy had discovered proof that Silas Vance had already begun siphoning funds from accounts he managed on behalf of several local farmers, funds Vance intended eventually to draw from the school endowment itself once he found a legal pretext to gain control of it. Abernathy wrote that he intended to remove the endowment entirely from Vance's bank and place it under the direct trusteeship of the county courts, safe from any banker's reach, and that he had already drawn up the papers to do so. He never got the chance. The sealed document Clara found beside the strongbox was, when she finally worked up the courage to break its wax seal, exactly that unfiled trust document, along with a letter addressed to whoever might one day find it, written in Abernathy's own hand, explaining that he had hidden both the endowment and the trust papers behind the blackboard rather than risk them vanishing into Silas Vance's ledgers before he could complete the legal transfer, trusting that his daughter, Margaret, who taught at the school after him, would know where to find them and finish what he had started. But Margaret Abernathy, the young woman in the daguerreotype, had married and moved east not long after her father's death, grieving too deeply and too suddenly to think of hidden rooms and unfinished paperwork, and the schoolhouse had passed, unused and increasingly forgotten, to a nephew and then a grandson who had no memory of Josiah at all, no knowledge of what the building's false wall concealed, only a deed they held with mild interest until it, too, became one more piece of paper in a dead man's estate. Silas Vance, meanwhile, had gone on to build the very bank his son Cyrus now ran, its early growth fueled, Clara now understood with a cold clarity, by the very funds he had already begun stealing from farmers and from the endowment before Abernathy's death cut short his full ambitions, funds whose theft had simply gone unpunished because the one man who had proof of it died before he could act, and his proof had been sealed inside a wall for 22 years. Clara sat with that knowledge for 3 sleepless nights before she told anyone. It would have been easy, unbearably easy, to say nothing at all, to quietly claim the strongbox's contents for herself and vanish from Larkspur Hollow entirely, taking with her enough gold and bond value, once she counted it by lantern light and found it staggering, to live comfortably for the rest of her life far from the town that had humiliated her. She turned that thought over many times in those long nights, and she would tell people later, once the whole story was known, that she did not consider herself especially virtuous for resisting it, only that her mother's voice kept returning to her, insisting that a person's worth was decided by what they chose to build, and that taking Abernathy's gold and running would mean building nothing at all, only repeating, in her own smaller way, exactly what Silas Vance had done. Word travels in a small town whether a person wishes it to or not, and it was Hiram Cole, arriving one morning to check on her progress and finding the strongbox open on the schoolroom floor, who first understood the shape of what she had found. Hiram, whose own family had lost a modest sum to Silas Vance's bank decades earlier in a dispute the old man had never forgotten, listened to Clara's careful account of the ledgers with a silence that gradually hardened into something like grim satisfaction, and it was Hiram who insisted, over Clara's own hesitation, that the discovery could not simply be handled quietly. He rode into Larkspur Hollow that same afternoon and returned 2 days later with Judge Elias Marsh, the circuit judge who rode through the county every several weeks to hear cases too large for the local magistrate, a man known through the territory for a stubborn, unhurried thoroughness that made him difficult to rush and impossible to bribe. When word reached Cyrus Vance that Clara Whitfield had found something inside the old Abernathy schoolhouse, something that had brought a circuit judge out to Larkspur Hollow ahead of his usual schedule, his response was immediate and unsubtle. He arrived at the schoolhouse himself, uninvited, on a fine bay horse, dressed as though for a Sunday service, and informed Clara with a smile that did not reach his eyes that the county had made a clerical error in allowing the auction to proceed at all, that the land in question had, in fact, been under a long-standing lien held by his bank against the Abernathy estate for unpaid taxes he claimed to have covered years ago, and that he would, out of Christian generosity, offer to purchase the property back from her at a modest profit over her original $9 so that the matter could be settled quietly and without further inconvenience to anyone. Clara, who by then had read enough of Josiah Abernathy's ledgers to recognize a Vance lie when she heard one dressed in its Sunday clothes, told him plainly that she had no intention of selling, and that Judge Marsh had already been shown the ledgers, the letter, and the unfiled trust document, and would be reviewing county tax records himself to confirm or deny any lien Cyrus claimed to hold. She watched something flicker across his face then, a crack in the composure he had worn like armor since the night he had driven her from her position, and he left without another word, though not before glancing once, involuntarily, toward the blackboard still standing open against the wall behind her. The days that followed brought a slow unraveling that the whole county would eventually watch with the particular fascination small towns reserve for the humbling of powerful men. Judge Marsh, working alongside the county recorder, confirmed within a week that no lien on the Abernathy property had ever been filed, that the tax claims Cyrus Vance referenced existed nowhere in the official record, and that the ledgers found behind the blackboard, cross-referenced against the bank's own surviving records from Silas Vance's era, painted a damning and consistent picture of decades-old embezzlement, funds diverted from farmers' accounts and from the school endowment itself. Funds whose absence had been quietly absorbed and hidden through the bank's own creative bookkeeping for 2 generations. Several of the older families in Larkspur Hollow, the Pruitts and the Coles and others whose fathers and grandfathers had banked with Silas Vance in those early years, came forward once the ledgers were made public, recognizing account numbers and figures that matched grievances their own families had nursed for decades without proof. Cyrus Vance, cornered by evidence he could not explain away, first tried bluster, then tried to claim ignorance of his father's affairs, and finally, when Judge Marsh made clear that a formal inquiry into the bank's records would proceed with or without his cooperation, he abruptly proposed a private settlement, offering to personally fund the restoration of the schoolhouse and to reinstate Clara to her former teaching position, quietly, without further scrutiny of the bank's history, if the matter could simply be allowed to rest. It was Clara herself, standing before the small crowd that had gathered outside the courthouse the day the settlement was proposed, who refused it, not out of vengeance, she told them, but because a debt owed to an entire town could not be paid off in a private room with a handshake, the same way it had not been Silas Vance's private business alone to decide what happened to a schoolhouse endowment meant for every child in the county. She proposed instead, with Judge Marsh's blessing and Hiram Cole standing solidly at her side, that the recovered endowment, the coin and the bonds Abernathy had hidden and protected with his life's careful planning, be placed exactly as he had originally intended, under trusteeship of the county courts, dedicated entirely to rebuilding the Abernathy schoolhouse and funding it as a free school for every child in the district, with Clara herself, if the newly reconstituted board would have her as its teacher. The town, humbled by the scale of what had been uncovered and grateful, many of them, for a resolution that returned old, remembered losses in the form of a school rather than the abstraction of a lawsuit, agreed without much dissent. Cyrus Vance, facing both the loss of his bank's reputation and formal inquiry into decades of his family's dealings, quietly resigned from the school board and, within the year, sold his interest in the bank and left Larkspur Hollow altogether, his name becoming, in the town's memory, a cautionary tale told to explain why the schoolhouse 2 miles out had once stood empty for 22 years. Clara Whitfield stood, that autumn, in the newly repaired schoolroom of the Abernathy schoolhouse, its roof mended, its walls freshly whitewashed, the great blackboard restored to its rightful place at the front of the room, no longer hiding anything at all, simply doing the honest work it had always been built for. She thought often, in those first weeks of teaching a new class of Larkspur Hollow children who had been given, through no doing of their own, a free education their grandparents had once been promised and nearly lost, of her mother's words about worth being decided by what a person chooses to build inside a room, and of her father kneeling in a field that looked, in March, like nothing at all. She had been called a fool for buying a ruin, laughed at across a courthouse yard for spending her last $9 on a building most people believed was worth less than the nails holding it together, and she understood now, standing at the front of a classroom full of children reading aloud with the same unashamed confidence she had once taught a stuttering boy named Samuel to find in his own voice, that the value of a thing was never visible to people who only looked at what it appeared to be from the outside. It had taken a woman with nothing left to lose, patient enough to notice a hairline seam in an old wall, to find what a good man had spent his whole fortune trying to protect. Thank you for spending this time with Clara's story, and with all of ours here. If it moved you, we'd be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need a reminder that value is rarely obvious at first glance, and if you'd leave us a comment telling us about a time you found worth in something the rest of the world had already written off, whether it was an old house, an old idea, or even a person others had given up on. Stories like Clara's remind us that restoration is possible even after the longest, quietest neglect, and that the truth, however carefully it's hidden, has a way of waiting patiently for someone willing to look closely enough to find it. Until next time, stay close.